A young mother's death investigation takes quite the turn months later when her boyfriend is arrested. What was believed to be an act of self-harm has now become a murder case. We're going to get into the reported history of the couple, the charges, potential evidence, and what led to this major development. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, this is a strange one, and full warning, not a ton of reporting on this either, so we kind of pieced together a lot of this from local papers. Just wanted to give that caveat, but we are talking about the death of Mariah Ashley Winter King out of Sweet Home, Oregon. Now, it's believed that she was 29 years old or 30 years old. Again, a little bit of mixed reporting on that. But she died about 8 months ago. But here's the thing. While it was initially determined that this might have been a death caused by Mariah's own hand from hanging, you fast forward to January 13th of this year, and according to the Albany Democrat-Herald, Mariah's boyfriend, 40-year-old Jerod Norman, has been arrested in connection with her death, now facing charges of second-degree murder and first-degree corpse abuse. Authorities reportedly believe that he killed Mariah at their shared residence on July 18th. Now, before we get into the law and the investigation and the more details, I have to give a little bit more information about who Mariah was, okay? Let's put a face to this. Now, her mother, Kimberly Lapham, apparently explained that Mariah was born in Arizona, raised in Albany, Oregon. She was a cheerleader. She was a varsity cheer captain in high school. According to her sister, Mariah King, Mariah, a mother of 2 young children, owned a tree service company with Norman, again, the suspect in her alleged killing, and it was called Bears Tree Care LLC. This is based on reporting from the Albany Democrat-Herald. And her family described her as someone who enjoyed outdoor activities, singing, painting rocks, was outgoing, full of love, had a deep faith in God. In fact, her sister Michaela said she didn't really attend any churches. She did mostly her own self-worship and prayer. She liked church music a lot too. This again is according to reporting from the Albany Democrat-Herald. Her mother added she was the type that even if she was going through something, she would set it aside and help somebody else with what they were going through. So now you're getting a sense of who this person was. But I also want to get into the apparent timeline of events as laid out by Mariah's family. And again, this is their version, but it is quite chilling and it is important, but I also have to call something out. Michaela set up a Facebook group for her sister called Justice for Mariah, and it provides updates on the criminal case, but also provides more photos and memories of Mariah in general. And with that, there's also a GoFundMe that was set up to raise money for Mariah's children. And it was set up by Michaela, and the opening message reads in part, "I'm starting this GoFundMe to get her babies justice. I want them to have a good start in life. They now have to grow up with their mom and know that something terrible happened to her. This, I am afraid, it will hurt their self-esteem, and I want to give them incentive to thrive. Please help in any way you can. If you can't donate, please share. I'm asking my community to help pull together and help support these children's future. They have a long road of recovery ahead of them." And before I go any further into this, I want to bring in criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, friend of the show, Anthony Osso, who specialized in domestic violence cases. Anthony, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Look, not a lot of details here. First, I had to ask, do you think it's strange to see what appeared to be a death from self-imposed hanging to now an arrest for murder so many months later?
I don't, Jesse, and I think the question or the answer really lies in your question in that they probably didn't have a lot of details. And so I think it's not uncommon for investigators to come to a scene and not know whether it was a homicide or whether it was a suicide until they sort of develop a further investigation through looking at maybe the medical examiner's evidence or talking to friends and family that might have a better understanding of the nature of the relationship between Mariah and Norman.
Speaking of that, if you go to the GoFundMe page, it accuses Norman, there's an accusation, accuses him of killing Mariah, staging the scene to look like she killed herself. Don't have the full details from authorities on all this, to be clear, but taking that allegation as true, how does one do that? How tough is that to stage a scene to make it look like that?
It's extremely difficult because anytime that there's a homicide, it's within the jurisdiction of the medical examiner in that county to then conduct an autopsy. And typically those are really thorough evaluations of what caused somebody to die. And so when you're talking about a strangulation, they're going to look for things like what type of object caused the damage to the neck or inability to breathe that would have led to her suffocating. And so it's very difficult because they're going to investigate further through that autopsy.
Yeah, this is a strange story. It's a sad one. It's a sad one. But look, we're glad we're able to bring it to you nonetheless and shine a light on what's happening there. And for that, I have to call out and thank our sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, because it's with their support that helps us to be able to produce these kinds of episodes. And by the way, this is America's largest personal injury law firm. They have over 1,000 attorneys. You know why? Because they win a lot. Listen to this. In the past few months, Morgan & Morgan secured a $29 million verdict for a bicyclist in Philadelphia, $2.7 million verdict for a car accident victim in Florida, not to mention $5.6 million for a car crash victim in Georgia after insurance offered that client $0. So even if you think your case isn't worth millions of dollars, why not start a claim and fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so simple. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. The Albany Democrat and the New Era Sweet Home News, they've reported that investigators wanted an examination of Mariah's body post-mortem, and it ultimately revealed, quote, a foreign object inside of her. What does that mean?
Looking at the tampering with a corpse allegation and some of the elements that could be involved in that, I don't want to speculate, but it could be penetration of her body with an object after she was already deceased. I don't know at this time. So until we get further evidence of that, it's really hard to say. And additionally, it could be something in her airway that prevented her from breathing. So it could be a number of different things.
And that's something that wouldn't be discovered upon her initial examination of the body. I mean, so that's the part that's interesting. It took several months before there to be arrest. I mean, there's a difference that what seemed apparent at the crime scene.
Sure. Well, that's when you say lodged inside, I don't think there are certain things that investigators can and cannot do on scene. So they are not allowed to mess with the body in certain ways. That's within the jurisdiction of a medical examiner. And so typically autopsies have to take place within a statutory amount of time from discovery of the body. So a medical examiner would find that kind of object within a couple days of the discovery of the body. And typically investigators are talking to medical examiners during their investigation. So it is odd that it would take a long time for investigators to figure that out.
You know, Anthony, it seems that most of the documents in this case are sealed. The manner of death hasn't been made public since the time of this broadcast. Why all the secrecy here? Is it maybe give you an indication about what happened to Mariah?
I think it's more, in my opinion, leads more towards an ongoing investigation than it does describing exactly what happened to Mariah. Oftentimes, if things can be sealed, if arrests have not been made, but here, I believe that Jerod's been made a suspect in this case. So I don't understand why records are still sealed at this point. Typically, you don't get copies of the autopsy report. They're not public. Those will remain in the state's file and they're disclosed to the defense. So I'm not surprised that we don't have a copy of that. So I can't speak to that.
You raised an interesting point when you were talking about abuse of the corpse. And I figured if there was some sort of sensitive nature to that, that might be why that information is not being released. And it makes me wonder, when would the public ever know about this? Only if it went to trial?
Well, I would think through the indictment. Typically, when somebody's indicted for a crime, that will become a public record. But the autopsy report itself is going to remain in the state's file. However, if they're alleging that there was some sort of tampering with a corpse and it was, not to jump to conclusions, but sexual in nature, that's something that the state is going to have to plead in their indictment to put defense on proper notice. So as gruesome as it might be, they still have to list it out in their statement of their allegations.
Look, you raise an important question because later on I'm going to go through what the actual text of these statutes are. And I think when it comes to abuse of the corpse, it's very specific. So we'll get to that in a second. We'll talk about it. But I want to actually now turn to the potential timeline of events. So this is based on reporting from the Albany Democrat and the New Era Sweet Home News. And again, this is a lot based upon the observations of those close to Mariah. So here's what we have. 6 days before Mariah died, Mariah King, again her sister, apparently called her. And this call ended with Mariah hanging up because it turned into a disagreement over her relationship with Norman. There apparently was an effort to get her to leave him, and this created tension in the family. And I'm going to get to that more in a minute. But according to Michaela, quote, she told me that he woke her up shaking the mattress and acting crazy, yelling at her and shaking her, telling her to get the F out of his house, and her kids were in the next room over sleeping. Now, reportedly, Mariah's mom called in a welfare check that night, but according to Michaela, when an officer stopped by, Mariah said everything was fine and told the officer to leave. And then you go to July 18th, 2024. Again, this is the day when we believe that Mariah died. So Mariah's friend Jeanette Taylor claims that Mariah shows up at her work, was, quote, super emotional, and asked Taylor, "Will you just please hold me like you're my mom?" Now, Taylor claimed that Mariah showed signs she may have been drinking, remarked that she didn't recognize herself, was happier in the past with an ex-boyfriend, but also wasn't ready to answer whether she wanted to leave Mr. Norman. And again, this is important because according to Taylor, Mariah had marks on her neck, but Mariah had apparently told her those were self-inflicted. And reportedly, Mariah's mom shows up, but Mariah apparently just went back home. Now, it's also being reported that her mom called the police to do a welfare check that night, but Mariah refused to open the door, told them to go away, and then it would be, an hour and a half later when the Lynn County Sheriff's Office and Sweet Home Police Department responded to a death in that home. And that now brings me back to Michaela, again, Mariah's sister, because she explains that she was getting ready to go to sleep that night when she reportedly gets this, quote, hysterical Facebook Messenger call from Norman at 11:35 p.m., where she claims he was crying and said Mariah was dead, that she had taken her own life, and that he was sorry. Now, Anthony, before I go into more of the backstory here,
Sure.
What do you take away from this possible reported timeline? I mean, it's pretty harrowing, but how do you sort out what exactly is going on here?
Well, I think that you're seeing a lot of emotional buildup in a relationship. And my legal mind is making me wonder, well, how am I going to get that evidence in a trial setting? But these are obviously emotional periods for both Mariah and Jerod. And so I think that it's odd that that would lead up right to a suicide. It seems more like if I'm the prosecutor, I'm going to use that to show a buildup of emotion and tension between the two parties to try and establish circumstantial evidence around what happened in the house.
Before I give the other side of that,
Sure.
maybe the possibility that she did harm herself, could that prior episode, you mentioned this, talking about getting into evidence, could that alleged episode from a few days before her death, could that come into the criminal case against Norman? I would imagine defense attorneys would say it's not relevant or maybe prejudicial of some kind.
Absolutely. I would object to it. I think the prosecutor might try and insinuate that it's the nature of the relationship evidence, which typically is admissible in murder trials. But from a prosecutor's perspective, I would try and argue that it was a then existing mental state and that to try and get around some sort of hearsay objection. But to your point, relevancy would really be tough to establish. And the defense might say at the same time, they might use that to show the mental state of Mariah in the days leading up to her death to say that she was very emotional and it had nothing to do with Jerod. So I would be interested to see how both sides use that evidence if it came into trial.
Now, here's what's interesting, exploring this whole dynamic in these relationships. According to Michaela, again, Mariah's sister, Norman would later claim it was Mariah's family's fault for her death, allegedly saying they weren't there for her. Michaela responded to this accusation that Kimberly, their mom, cut off contact with Mariah by saying, wait a second, she only did that because Mariah wouldn't stop seeing Norman, that, quote, he was becoming a huge problem. So now you might be asking, what exactly is being reported about this relationship? Well, let's go back to the New Era Sweet Home News. And what you're about to hear is based on reporting from this outlet. So it doesn't appear that Mariah's mom had any prior knowledge or was aware of any physical abuse between Norman and Mariah. However, remember when I mentioned there are these tensions in this family? It has been reported that her mom did believe Norman was controlling Mariah in all sorts of ways, that she advised her daughter that there are, quote, flags and she should think about getting away. And according to family and even neighbors, Mariah allegedly complained about Norman, that he would allegedly give her the silent treatment or would emotionally or mentally abuse her. And according to the reporting, since the beginning, there may have been issues, dating back to when the couple first got together in 2021, because family and friends apparently noticed a difference in Mariah's personality. There was a claim that she started drinking, and that according to her mom, Mariah distanced herself away from her. Now, Norman has been described by those in Mariah's life as standoffish, that he would avoid them. And by the way, based on the reporting, it wasn't just a family or friend's intuition or observation. It was reported that Sweet Home Police Department Detective Sean Potter remarked that police had started getting disturbance calls from the couple's neighbors right at the beginning of this relationship too. And interestingly, Potter reportedly indicated that Norman had been cooperative during the investigations into these matters and was straightforward but intense. Now, we have two different versions. And what do I mean by that? So Mariah's mom explained, quote, "I'm not positive that he ever told her not to come see me, but she started noticing that his behaviors would increase or he would give her the silent treatment if she had went and spent the day with me or siblings or anything like that. So she'd pull away from us. It was easier for her to stay away than to make waves at home." But then you hear from Tiana Garcia. This is apparently Mr. Norman's former girlfriend and mother to one of his sons, who reportedly claimed that she heard Mariah just wasn't close with her family and that she believed they wanted to take away her kids, hence the distancing. She remarked, quote, "He was very much stuck in his ways, which at times caused rift, but Jerod is the type of person that can have someone screaming in his face and he will shut the door and ignore you until he's ready to deal with it in a calm manner. Sure, we would fight and he was insensitive at times, but people aren't perfect." She went on to say, "He's not a killer. He loved Mariah. Mariah loved him. She had a lot of issues that needed a lot of attention, and when she didn't get it, she would throw fits." Now, Anthony, back and forth, what do you take away from this? How do we understand, look, the way I look at it is people's observations are important, right? This could all be testimony, but what they're told about someone or maybe their own interactions with someone could be very different than what Mariah was experiencing. Again, I'm trying to make sense of this relationship. I'm trying to make sense of the competing narratives here.
Well, absolutely. It's and I think that's why the law really restricts witnesses' abilities to get into things like that and their observations. I mean, in order to really get into evidence about Jerod and Mariah, I think you have to actually have observed them together to really discuss the nature of the relationship. And so I understand that the families both have their opinions on what they thought happened. That's not uncommon in these kinds of cases, especially when the alleged murder occurs between people that were dating and love each other. But I think it really muddies up the relationship evidence. And I think that the investigation really needs to be focused a lot on the physical evidence that was involved in that scene.
By the way, talking about Garcia, and again, this is all from the New Era, she believes Norman is innocent and that her son and Norman were together and found Mariah dead in that shed. And apparently, Norman's father and his son's friend were there at one point too, and that their son indicated Norman was hysterically crying. She believes this wasn't a murder, but rather a case of Mariah taking her own life. And I'll couple with this one that even Mariah's family admitted she struggled in the past, contemplated killing herself, and even allegedly back in July of 2022, took Norman's gun and called her mom telling her she wanted to die. Now, Anthony, aside from the fact that you might have potential witnesses here who were there, there is this other aspect to it that has to be considered.
I agree. I mean, I think that that's extremely important evidence, the fact that there were suicidal ideations. I know that they were distinguishing between actual suicide attempts and ideations, but that's really important evidence. And it's a tough case and it's kind of a tough call when you know that there's behavior consistent with what the original, theory in the investigation was that would have corroborated believing she committed suicide. So it's very tough to say. And then now you've got an alibi about him having not even been at the house when her body was found.
But the thing is they arrested him for a reason, right? It can't just be the apparent lack of a note or a mom leaving her two children, because obviously those are key factors. It may help the prosecution's case in saying this is not somebody who would have done something to herself, but I feel there has to be more against Norman than just that.
I agree. I think that, and I really think that it has to do with physical evidence in that autopsy. And it could be things like scraping under the fingernails and running DNA. I mean, that might lead to the idea that there was some sort of struggle during her suffocation. I mean, a lot of times you will see people scratching at their own neck, but I just wonder if there's additional physical evidence that investigators are relying on that we as the public don't know about yet. That would be in the state's file.
Yeah, and I want to get to the charges because I do think that will help us. It might illuminate a little bit of some of the questions we have, but just to let everybody know, so the children, right, her children, it's being reported that those children are living with their father. But a little side note as well to all of this. So after that incident that I mentioned, apparently Mariah's mom, Kimberly Lapham, drove out, met her, this is again when she might have been about to harm herself, convinced her to come stay with her, but that Norman allegedly started reaching out again and even reportedly threatened Lapham, again this mother, and that resulted in him being charged with telephonic harassment. This is based on the reporting. And also, this is interesting too, the reporting indicates that Norman and Mariah, they had this business together, right? They maybe had difficulties in the relationship, but then Mariah's mom claims that her daughter was maybe making preparations should she leave Norman. Those are a lot of different factors there, Anthony. You have thoughts on those?
Again, just a lot of different facts going on here that would indicate that there is issues going on in the relationship, which is something that you typically find out when there's a homicide between two partners. So I think it is consistent with the theory of homicide. But again, there are so many different facts going on here that it's really hard to say. And I'm curious what is actually in the investigative file that has led them to file these charges.
The Albany Democrat, by the way, also reported that authorities were looking to speak with Norman's father for a second interview. Don't really know when that was or the context of it. Why would they be wanting to speak to him?
It sounds like if they believe that Jerod was hysterical on scene and it showed up and found the body in the shed and he had knowledge of that, they might want to make sure maybe they've taken his statement and since then have found out additional facts that have helped them develop more questions, or maybe they think he was lying, or maybe not lying, but untruthful in his interview, and they want to confront him with those issues. So again, with an ongoing investigation, it's unlikely that we're going to get to see a lot of the intimate details of an investigation.
Let me get real quick to the charges. So we have second-degree murder, and it is defined when it is committed intentionally, except that it is an affirmative defense that at the time of the homicide, the defendant was under the influence of an extreme emotional disturbance, or felony murder, so killing in the course of another crime, such as a burglary, a kidnapping, assault, sexual offense. And we don't know yet, but that might tell us something. And then you go to the other charge, abuse of a corpse in the first degree. Engages in sexual activity with a corpse or involving a corpse, or dismembers, mutilates, cuts, or strikes a corpse. I said it's very specific. Those two charges, the language of those two charges, Anthony, does that give you a theory of the case?
It's really tough to say because the corpse charge, I mean, that insinuates that whatever he would have done to be charged with that crime means that Mariah was already deceased at that point. So it really takes felony murder off the table, in my opinion. And when I think of felony murder, I think of the evading arrest where the person runs the stoplight and kills a family. It's very distinguishable from capital murder where you're committing sexual assault and then kill somebody intentionally within that act. And so
it wouldn't be a robbery or burglary because it was their shared residence.
Exactly. I mean, maybe sexual assault and maybe acts within sexual encounter went too far, but we're just speculating.
Or it was, an intentional killing and he did something to the body to dismember it or mutilate it or cut it or strike it in order to pose it in a certain scenario. I mean, again, that's the allegation put forward. Sure. It's a really sad case. We're going to continue to keep an eye on it. It is being reported that a final resolution conference is scheduled for March 11th. Anthony Osso, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.